James Wilson had served in the Royal Guard for 15 years, his journey marked by sweat and sacrifice. Each morning, he polished his boots until they shone like black mirrors, adjusted his uniform with practiced precision, and took his post with quiet pride. As one of the few black officers in this elite unit, James had earned his place through hard work and excellent service, rising through the ranks despite the occasional raised eyebrow or whispered comment. The Royal Guard wasn't just a job to James, it was a calling. His grandfather had served in the British Army during World War II, and his father had continued the tradition. Now James stood tall in his red uniform and bearskin hat, representing centuries of history. Though most visitors treated the guards with respect, James had developed a thick skin for those who didn't. Some tourists seemed surprised to see a black man in this position, their curious glances lingering a bit too long. On particularly hot days, standing motionless for hours tested even the most seasoned guards. This Tuesday was brutally warm, the sun beating down on James as sweat trickled down his back beneath the heavy uniform. He kept his eyes forward, face expressionless as tradition demanded. The crowds were larger than usual, tourists from around the world gathering to watch the famous guards and take photographs. James noticed a particular group growing louder as the afternoon wore on. A heavy-set man with sunburned cheeks seemed to be entertaining his friends with jokes, pointing occasionally in James's direction. James had seen this behavior before and kept his focus straight ahead, his mind wandering to the fishing trip he had planned with his son that weekend. The palace grounds hummed with activity, children eating ice cream, tour guides explaining royal history, visitors snapping photos. James had learned to tune out the noise while remaining alert for any security concerns. His training had taught him to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. As James completed his mental checklist of the area, he caught fragments of conversation from the loud group. "Don't seem right," and "not traditional" floated toward him. His jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign that he'd heard anything at all. After 15 years, James knew what was coming next. Most days passed without incident. James took pride in representing his country, in standing as living history for visitors from around the world. He remembered how his daughter had beamed with pride when she first saw him in uniform, how his mother had cried happy tears at his graduation ceremony. These memories sustained him through uncomfortable moments like this one. The palace gardens bloomed with summer flowers, their sweet scent occasionally reaching James on the gentle breeze. Nearby, a young family posed for photos, the children waving excitedly at the stoic guard. James maintained his blank expression, though he always enjoyed seeing the wonder in children's eyes, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. As the afternoon wore on, the sunburned man's voice grew louder. James focused on his breathing, on the weight of tradition he carried. He thought about the long line of guards who had stood in this exact spot before him, men of different backgrounds who had all worn the uniform with honor. He would do the same, no matter what challenges the day might bring. Little did James know that in just a few minutes, an encounter with this loud tourist would test his training and character in ways he couldn't imagine, creating a moment that would soon be seen by millions around the world. The summer heat had drawn massive crowds to the palace that day. Tourists from every corner of the world filled the grounds, their excited chatter creating a constant buzz in the air. For most visitors, seeing the royal guards was a highlight of their trip, a chance to witness a living piece of history. Most kept a respectful distance, admiring the guards' discipline and taking photos from afar. Richard, an American tourist in his 50s with a booming voice and a sunburned face, had been growing steadily louder throughout the afternoon. He wore a brightly colored Hawaiian shirt and kept wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled napkin. His friends seemed uncomfortable with his behavior, occasionally trying to quiet him or pull him away, but Richard wasn't having it. "Hey, look at this guy," Richard called out, pointing directly at James. "Since when do they let people like him guard the palace?" His words sliced through the pleasant murmur of the crowd, causing nearby tourists to turn and stare. A woman with 2 young children quickly moved away, shooting Richard a disgusted look. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward as he'd been trained. Inside, he felt the familiar twist in his stomach that came with these situations, but his face betrayed nothing. 15 years of service had taught him how to wear his dignity like armor. I'm just saying, Richard continued, his voice growing louder as if trying to provoke a reaction. When I think of these guards, I think of tradition. This doesn't look right to me. He gestured widely, encouraging others to agree. No one did. A teenage girl recording the guards on her phone turned her camera toward Richard instead, her expression clearly disapproving. An elderly British couple nearby exchanged glances, the woman shaking her head sadly. Some people, she murmured to her husband, loud enough for others to hear. No respect. Richard's friends looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them, a shorter man in glasses, tugged at his arm. Come on, let's go see the gardens, he suggested, trying to defuse the situation. But Richard shook him off, his eyes narrowed as he stared at James. I paid good money to visit this place, Richard announced to no one in particular. I want to see the real thing, not some diversity hire. Several people in the crowd gasped. A young couple walked away in obvious disgust, and a tour guide leading a small group quickly redirected them to another area. The atmosphere had shifted from cheerful tourism to tense discomfort. A security officer monitoring the area began moving toward Richard, but before he could intervene, Richard broke away from his group. Ignoring the rope barriers that kept visitors at a safe distance, he stepped closer to James than regulations allowed. Hey, you, Richard called, his face flushed with heat and alcohol. I'm talking to you. How'd you get this job anyway? Don't they care about keeping things traditional around here? The crowd fell silent. Several people had their phones out now, recording the confrontation. James could see them from the corner of his eye, but he maintained his position, standing straight as an arrow, his rifle perfectly positioned, his eyes focused ahead. One of Richard's friends called out, Rich, seriously, stop it. You're embarrassing us. But Richard was too far gone, too invested in getting a reaction. He stepped even closer, violating the perimeter around the guard post. Do you even speak English? Richard taunted, his voice dropping lower, becoming more menacing. Or did they just put you here for the tourists? Some kind of joke. The security officer was moving faster now, speaking into his radio. Two palace staffers were hurrying over as well, concern evident on their faces. But they were still too far away to prevent what happened next. Richard, emboldened by James's lack of response and seemingly unaware of the severity of his actions, stepped right up to the guard platform. What he said next was so offensive that several people in the crowd audibly gasped. The slur hung in the air like poison, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. No one knew how James would respond, or if the strict protocols of the Royal Guard would finally break under such a direct and hateful provocation. The ugly word hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, the entire courtyard seemed frozen in shock. A mother covered her young son's ears, her face twisted with disgust. An elderly man in a veteran's cap shook his head slowly, muttering, disgraceful. Two teenage girls looked at each other with wide eyes, both recording the scene on their phones. Richard stood there, swaying slightly, a smug smile spreading across his sunburned face. He clearly expected, perhaps even wanted, James to break protocol, to lash out, to give him something to complain about later. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue. He taunted, leaning in even closer. The air felt electric with tension. A group of Japanese tourists whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable. A British family stood rigid with embarrassment, the father looking like he wanted to intervene but unsure how. Security was still pushing through the crowd, but they were caught behind a large tour group moving in the opposite direction. James remained completely still, a living statue. His eyes focused on the middle distance, exactly as his training dictated. But something was happening that few in the crowd could see. A small muscle in his jaw tightened ever so slightly. His breathing, normally measured and controlled, deepened to just a fraction. Inside, James was making a decision. Richard, encouraged by the lack of response, raised his voice. Hey, I'm talking to you. You don't belong here, and you know it. He turned to the crowd, as if seeking approval, but found only hostile stares and raised phones. For a brief second, uncertainty flashed across his face, but the alcohol in his system pushed him forward. You gonna say something, or just stand there? Richard sneered, leaning in until he was close enough that James could smell the beer on his breath. And then, breaking with hundreds of years of tradition, James moved. It wasn't a big movement. He didn't swing his rifle or step off his mark. Instead, he turned his head just 45 degrees until his eyes met Richard's directly. The crowd gasped. Royal Guards never broke position, never. "Sir," James said, his voice calm and measured, carrying across the now silent courtyard. "I am Sergeant James Wilson of Her Majesty's Royal Guard. My grandfather fought at Normandy alongside American troops. My father served in the Gulf. I've served in Iraq and Afghanistan before taking this post." Richard blinked, taken aback by the unexpected response. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Black soldiers have served the crown since the 1700s, James continued, his voice steady and educational rather than angry. "Men who look like me fought and died in every major conflict Britain has faced. We've always been here, sir, always. You just haven't been paying attention." The crowd was absolutely silent now. A tour guide who had been about to lead her group away stopped, motioning for them to wait. A pair of businessmen who had been walking by halted in their tracks, briefcases still in hand. Everyone was watching this unexpected history lesson unfold. "The uniform I wear has been earned through service, dedication, and sacrifice," James said, "just like every guard who stands at this post. Our skin color may vary, but our commitment to duty does not." Richard's face had drained of its earlier confidence. He looked around, suddenly aware that dozens of people were watching and recording. His friends had backed away, clearly wanting no part of the situation. "Now," James said, his voice taking on an official tone, "you have crossed the security barrier, which is a violation of palace rules. Security is approaching to escort you to the exit. I suggest you go with them without further incident." As if on cue, 2 security officers finally broke through the crowd. Richard's belligerence seemed to evaporate as he realized the situation he'd created. He took a step back, raising his hands slightly. "I didn't mean," he started, but then stopped, apparently unable to find any way to justify what he'd just done. The security officers flanked Richard, firmly but professionally indicating that he needed to leave. As they began escorting him away, James did something else unexpected. He returned to his position, eyes forward, perfectly still once more, as if nothing had happened. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Someone shouted, "Well done." A woman wiped tears from her eyes. The history lesson delivered with such dignity had transformed an ugly moment into something powerful and educational. And as the guards led Richard away, the phones stayed up, recording every second of the confrontation that would soon be shared around the world. James's unexpected response left the crowd speechless. For a guard to break position was almost unheard of, but the way he had done it, with such calm dignity, made the moment even more powerful. People stood watching, many still recording, as Richard was escorted away by security. "I've been coming here for 30 years, an older British woman said to her companion, loud enough for others to hear. "Never seen anything like it. Good for him." The applause had died down, but the energy in the courtyard had completely changed. Strangers were talking to each other, discussing what they'd witnessed. A history teacher from Canada was explaining to her students how significant the moment had been. "The guards almost never break character," she explained. "This will probably be in the news tomorrow." She was right, though none of them knew just how big the story would become. James had returned to his position, standing perfectly still once more. If not for the dozens of videos already being shared online, it might have seemed like nothing had happened at all. But behind his composed exterior, James's heart was racing. In 15 years, he had never broken protocol. He wondered briefly if there would be consequences, but he didn't regret his decision. As Richard disappeared from view, being led toward the exit gates, a young black boy of about 10 approached the barrier. He looked up at James with wide, admiring eyes. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said softly. James didn't respond or move. He had already broken protocol once. He wouldn't do it again. The boy's father came up behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember what I told you," he said gently. "They're not allowed to talk to us or move. It's their job." "But he just did," the boy pointed out. "That was different," his father explained. "That was special circumstances." "I just wanted to say thank you," the boy called out to James. "I want to be a guard too when I grow up." Though James gave no outward sign of having heard, inside he felt a surge of emotion. This was exactly why he had spoken up, not just to educate one ignorant man, but to show everyone watching that people like him belonged here, had always belonged here. Nearby, a palace staff member was speaking into her radio, occasionally glancing at James. 20 minutes later, a senior officer appeared at the edge of the courtyard. He observed for a while, then disappeared inside. James noticed, but maintained his position. Whatever consequences came, he would face them with the same dignity he had shown today. The crowd gradually changed as the afternoon wore on, but the story of what had happened spread quickly. New visitors arrived having already heard about the incident from social media. Some came specifically hoping to see that guard who stood up to the racist, as one American tourist put it rather loudly. When James's shift finally ended and his replacement arrived, he marched precisely as trained back through the small door that led to the guard's facilities. As soon as he was out of public view, he was met by his commanding officer, Captain Bailey. "Wilson," the captain said, his face unreadable. "My office now." James followed, his back straight, preparing himself for a reprimand or worse. The Royal Guard valued tradition above almost everything else. Breaking character was a serious offense. Inside the office, Captain Bailey closed the door and turned to face him. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied James's face. "You broke protocol today, Sergeant," he finally said. "Yes, sir, I did." "In 15 years of service, you've never once done so." "No, sir." Captain Bailey nodded slowly. "The palace has received over 200 calls in the last 3 hours. Emails are pouring in. The video is everywhere." James swallowed hard but said nothing. "Under normal circumstances, there would be disciplinary action," the captain continued. Then, unexpectedly, his stern expression softened slightly. "But these aren't normal circumstances, are they?" "Sir?" "What you did out there." Captain Bailey paused, choosing his words carefully. It reflected the highest values of the Guard, even while breaking with tradition. You educated rather than escalated. You showed more discipline by speaking than most would have by remaining silent. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. "The palace is issuing a statement supporting your actions," the captain continued. "And I'm personally commending you for exceptional judgment in an unusual situation." James blinked in surprise. "Thank you, sir." "The Royal Guard has been evolving for centuries, Wilson. Sometimes it takes moments like this to remind us why." As James finally left the palace that evening, exhausted but relieved, he had no idea that his phone was already filled with messages from family and friends who had seen the videos online. By morning, his simple history lesson would reach millions around the world. By morning, the video had exploded online. James woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. His brother had texted, "You're famous, man. Check the news." His mother had left 3 voicemails, her voice proud but worried about the attention. Even his teenage daughter, who normally found her father's job totally boring, had shared the video with the caption, "This is my dad." James sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through social media in disbelief. The original video had over 7 million views already. News websites had picked up the story with headlines like, "Royal Guard's perfect response to racist taunt and history lesson at the palace goes viral." His face was everywhere. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes tiredly. James had never sought attention. He'd simply done what felt right in the moment. His phone rang, his sister calling from Manchester. "James, have you seen? You're everywhere. Mom's been calling everyone we know." "I've seen," he said quietly. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" "A bit much?" "You're a hero. People are calling you the teaching guard. There are memes. Good ones too." James couldn't help but smile at his sister's excitement. "I was just doing my job." "No, you were doing more than your job. That's why people love it." As James prepared for his shift, he wondered how he'd face the inevitable attention. The Royal Guard valued anonymity and tradition. Standing out wasn't exactly encouraged. Yet Captain Bailey's words from yesterday gave him comfort. Sometimes tradition needed to evolve. Arriving at the palace, James immediately noticed the difference. The usual crowd had doubled in size. People stood 3 deep at the barriers, many clearly hoping to spot that guard from the video. Several wore T-shirts with slogans about respect and history. One elderly man held a small sign reading "Thank you for your service." All of it. James's colleagues treated him differently too. There were respectful nods, quiet words of support. Even guards who rarely spoke to him made a point to catch his eye or pat his shoulder as they passed. "Quite the celebrity, Wilson," said Officer Thompson, a veteran guard with 30 years of service. James had always found Thompson intimidating, a stickler for rules who rarely smiled. "Not by choice, sir," James replied cautiously. To his surprise, Thompson's weathered face broke into a brief smile. "My granddaughter called me last night, all excited. Said she'd seen what happened. Asked me if I knew you." He paused. "I was proud to say I did." Before James could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of the palace communications director, Mrs. Hughes, a sharp-dressed woman who typically had little interaction with the guards. "Sergeant Wilson," she said briskly, "the palace has issued an official statement supporting your actions yesterday. Additionally, we've had numerous interview requests from major networks. Obviously, we've declined them all, as is protocol, but I wanted you to be aware." "Thank you, ma'am," James replied, feeling slightly overwhelmed. "There's more," she continued. "Richard Caldwell, the American tourist involved in yesterday's incident, has issued a public apology." This genuinely surprised James. "He has?" Mrs. Hughes nodded, checking her tablet. "It was posted about 3 hours ago. Quite comprehensive, actually. He acknowledges his behavior was inexcusable and embarrassing. Says your response was a lesson in dignity that he won't forget." James wasn't sure how to feel about that. He hadn't expected an apology, certainly not a public one. "He's receiving quite a lot of criticism online," Mrs. Hughes added. "His employer has issued a statement as well, distancing themselves from his actions. I believe he's facing some professional consequences." James frowned. "I didn't want that. I just wanted him to understand." "Well," Mrs. Hughes said, studying James with newfound respect, "based on his statement, it seems he does now." As James took his position that day, he noticed Richard's friends from yesterday standing respectfully behind the barrier. They looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Finally, one stepped forward slightly. "He's gone home early," the man said quietly. "But he wanted us to say he's truly sorry. What you said, it changed something in him. Thank you." James gave no sign of having heard, his eyes fixed forward as protocol demanded. But inside, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was the response he had hoped for, not shame or punishment, but understanding. The crowd watched, many filming again, but this time with reverence rather than shock. Something had shifted, not just for Richard, but for everyone who had witnessed or shared in this unexpected moment of education. The video continued to spread like wildfire across social media platforms. By the end of the week, it had been viewed over 50 million times and translated into 23 languages. News programs around the world featured segments about James, analyzing his calm response and the history he had shared. Educators praised the teachable moment. Historians came forward to expand on James's brief lesson about black soldiers in British history, and military veterans from various countries voiced their support. James tried to maintain his normal routine despite the attention. He took his usual morning run, helped his daughter with her math homework, and played weekend football with his friends. But everywhere he went, people recognized him. In the grocery store, an elderly woman squeezed his arm and thanked him. At his daughter's school, other parents asked for pictures. Even at the pub where he occasionally met friends, the bartender refused to let him pay for his drinks. "It's a bit much," James confided to his brother over dinner at his mother's house. "I just did what felt right at the moment. I didn't think it would turn into all this." "That's exactly why people connected with it," his brother replied. "It wasn't planned or calculated. It was honest." His mother, who had been quietly listening, nodded in agreement. "Your father would have been so proud," she said softly, mentioning James's late father who had served in the military for 30 years. The simple statement meant more to James than all the public praise combined. At the palace, things had begun to settle into a new normal. The initial surge of curious visitors had tapered off, though tourist numbers remained higher than usual. James continued his duties with the same dedication he always had, though he noticed younger guards watching him with undisguised admiration. 10 days after the incident, Captain Bailey called James into his office again. "The palace has received something unusual," the captain explained, sliding an envelope across his desk. It's addressed specifically to you. James picked up the envelope cautiously. It bore an American postmark. We've screened it, of course, Captain Bailey assured him. It's just a letter. Back in the privacy of the guard's changing room, James opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard, the tourist who had confronted him. The handwriting was uneven, as if written by someone unused to lengthy correspondence. Dear Sergeant Wilson, it began. I've written and torn up this letter 5 times now. No words seem adequate for what I need to say, but I'll try again. Richard explained that he'd returned home to face not only public backlash, but the personal disappointment of his family. His teenage son had refused to speak to him for days. His wife had cried when she saw the video. His mother, the daughter of a World War II veteran, had called to express her shame. I've spent my life thinking I wasn't prejudiced, Richard wrote. I told myself I just appreciated tradition and history. Your response showed me how little I actually knew about either. The letter continued, explaining that Richard had begun reading books about the contributions of black soldiers throughout British and American military history. He described his shock at discovering how much had been left out of the history he learned in school. I can't undo what I did, the letter concluded, but I wanted you to know that your dignified response changed something fundamental in me. You could have responded with anger or simply ignored me, and either would have been justified. Instead, you chose to educate me and everyone watching. I will carry that lesson for the rest of my life. With deepest respect and sincerest apologies, Richard Caldwell. James sat with the letter for a long time, emotions washing over him in waves. He had hoped his words might change Richard's thinking, but he hadn't expected such a profound impact. That evening, James showed the letter to his mother when he stopped by for their weekly dinner. What do you think? He asked after she had read it. Does he mean it? His mother studied the letter again, her expression thoughtful. The true test isn't in his words, she said finally. It's in what he does with this new understanding going forward. James nodded, realizing she was right. The same could be said for everyone who had watched the video, shared it, commented on it. Would this moment lead to lasting change or just become another viral sensation soon forgotten? As he drove home that night, James thought about Richard's journey of reflection and his own unexpected role in prompting it. Perhaps this was the most important guard duty he had ever performed, not protecting a building, but standing watch over principles of dignity and respect that transcended borders and uniforms. 6 months after the incident, James sat in the waiting area of a primary school in East London. The colorful walls were decorated with children's artwork and educational posters. A display board near the entrance proudly announced, "Special guest speaker today, Sergeant James Wilson." The school's headmaster, Mrs. Parker, emerged from her office with a warm smile. "They're all ready for you, Sergeant Wilson. Quite excited, actually. We've had to combine 3 classes because so many teachers wanted their students to hear you speak." James nodded, adjusting his tie nervously. Public speaking had never been his strength, yet here he was about to address a room full of children. It was his 5th school visit this month. "Just be yourself," Mrs. Parker advised, noting his tension. The children respond to authenticity more than anything else. The assembly hall was packed with students aged 9 to 11. They sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces turned up expectantly as James walked to the front. A few whispered excitedly, pointing at him. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his deep voice carrying easily across the room. "My name is Sergeant James Wilson, and I serve in the Royal Guard." A forest of hands shot up immediately. James smiled. Children were always more eager with questions than adults. "Yes, the uniform is quite heavy," he answered one boy. "No, we're not allowed to smile on duty," he told a girl with bright beads in her hair. About 8 hours, with short breaks, he explained to another about his shift length. Then a small boy at the back raised his hand. "Is it true you stood up to a bully? We saw the video in our history class." The room went quiet. James took a deep breath. This was why he was really here, not just to talk about fancy uniforms and palace traditions. "I didn't see it as standing up to a bully," James explained carefully. "I saw it as a chance to teach someone something they didn't know." He went on to explain, in simple terms the children could understand, about the long history of diverse soldiers serving Britain. He showed photographs of black soldiers from World War I, World War II, and more recent conflicts. The children leaned forward, completely engaged. Sometimes, James said, people say unkind things because they don't know better. Education is more powerful than anger. A girl with glasses raised her hand. Were you scared to speak up? James considered this. Not scared, exactly. But I knew I was breaking the rules of my job. Sometimes, though, you have to decide which rules matter most. After the talk, as James prepared to leave, the headmaster handed him a bundle of thank you cards the children had made. You've made quite an impact, she said. 3 of our students now say they want to join the Royal Guard when they grow up. Later that week, James attended a ceremony at the palace. The Queen had requested his presence, along with several other guards who represented the diversity of the modern Royal Guard. It wasn't the first such event since the video went viral, but it was perhaps the most significant. The palace had used the incident as a catalyst for change. A new educational program highlighted the contributions of soldiers from various backgrounds throughout British history. Training for new guards now included a module on the diversity of the regiment's past. Applications from minority candidates had increased by 40%. As James stood at attention during the ceremony, he caught sight of his family in the audience. His mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. His daughter, now 13, watched with undisguised pride. His brother gave him a subtle thumbs up. Captain Bailey approached James after the formal proceedings. I've been asked to inform you about your promotion, he said quietly. It's been approved. You'll be taking over training duties for new recruits starting next month. James blinked in surprise. Sir? Don't look so shocked. Wilson, who better to teach the next generation what it truly means to wear the uniform? That evening, as James walked home through London's busy streets, his phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had sent him a link to a news article from America. Richard, the tourist from the incident, had started a scholarship fund for minority students interested in military history. The fund was named the Wilson Scholarship in James's honor. James stopped walking, staring at his phone in disbelief. People rushed past him on the sidewalk, unaware of the emotions surging through him. This was never what he had intended or expected when he broke protocol that summer day. He had simply spoken truth as he knew it, shared the history he carried within him. Sometimes the smallest actions create the widest ripples. James had stood his ground that day, not with anger or force, but with dignity and education. In doing so, he had reminded everyone watching what true strength looks like.